One of the oldest living orcas in captivity is hanging on to her life. Surviving pneumonia is one thing. Will Lolita survive Miami Seaquarium? That's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, Lolita, light of my life, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul, Lolita. No, not the literary masterpiece by Nabokov. Lolita, the 56-year-old, full-bodied, 20-foot, 7,500-pound orca. Lolita, from the southern resident breed, captured at Penn Cove, Washington when she was 4. Lolita, then immediately sold to the Seaquarium in Miami, where she has lived since 1970, but alone without an orca companion since 1980, more than 40 years, living in an 80-foot wide tank that is more like a liquid straitjacket. It's called The Smallest Tank in North America, by Captain Paul Watson in his book Orcapedia. Now, Lolita is suffering, not just from the symptoms of abnormal repetitive behavior and the psychological trauma from confinement, but now from pneumonia, according to a whistleblower who called PETA, and possibly suffering too from the inadequate care after the Seaquarium fired a longtime veterinarian who had complained about the conditions for animals. Last year, PETA revealed a damning 17-page federal inspection report that included animal welfare violations. Lolita has PETA's Jared Goodman, the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Animal Law, Legal, and Corporate Affairs, battling on her behalf. Jared and I talked about Lolita and the Miami Seaquarium on the PETA Podcast.
So the Miami Seaquarium is a facility located in Miami, Florida, in the Biscayne Bay area that's been around since the 1950s. And in the late 60s and early 70s, they decided to buy some recently captured orcas for the very first time. So they brought into the tiny tanks that they have there a killer whale named Hugo. And then about a year later, Lolita. And that was in 1970, in August 1970, when she was captured off of the coast of Washington state. She was one of 7 who were rounded up and sent to marine parks, but the only one who was sent to the Seaquarium. So as of that time, they had 2 orcas in this tank. In 1980, Hugo died after repeatedly ramming his head into the side of his tank there. The side of the tank in which they're both held. So since 1980, 42 years now, Lolita has been without the company of another orca, despite the fact that these are incredibly intelligent, complex, and social beings.
So tell me about just that kind of existence. Is it similar to solitary confinement? Would it be that sort of thing, or would it be worse than that? What is it analogous to?
You know, it's hard to say anything is worse than solitary confinement, knowing what we know about the detrimental impact that has on the human brain. But given that orcas have brains that are as complex and highly developed as humans, we know that it is likely similar conditions are likely similarly distressing to them and impactful. So Lolita's tank measures only 20 feet deep at its very deepest point, and she is 20 feet long. There are other parts of the tank that are only 12 feet, and even apart from that, the water is also often reduced in the tank to give her even less space. The tank at its longest width is only 80 feet. That's 4 body lengths for her. You know, PETA often says this is the equivalent of a human living in a bathtub, and that isn't very hyperbolic. This is a person who is essentially in solitary confinement. But the Seaquarium takes it one step further. It makes it even worse for her by housing her with Pacific white-sided dolphins who are incompatible with her and rake her skin with their teeth, apparently so severely that she's had to be medicated with antibiotics after being attacked by them.
Wait a minute now. she's in this small confined space and she has to share it?
That's exactly right. With one or two Pacific white-sided dolphins, and these are just they're not compatible species. In particular, the individuals she's been held with are not compatible with her, and we know that from the Seaquarium's own records showing that she is repeatedly attacked by them. And orca biologists indicate that while orcas are the apex predator of the ocean, so you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be attacked, this is a matter of mobbing behavior. So the Pacific white-sided dolphins are threatened by this larger apex predator in their tank. And because they're smaller and able to maneuver better in this incredibly confined space, they're able to attack her.
Well, I think what people really can't fathom, unless they know orcas, you're saying that Lolita is 20 feet long, but that's like 7,500 pounds of orca, which is massive. And so you just imagine this small space, which you say is about a depth of 20 feet in the middle, about 12 foot around the edges. You're not talking about a big space. And then you have these little annoying porpoises. They're like,
they're just another species of dolphin. The Seaquarium has, I think, perhaps put those animals in the tank because the Federal Animal Welfare Act requires that social animals be housed with a member of a compatible species. The USDA has long signed off on allowing them to keep these animals together and that being sufficient companionship for Lolita, even though every expert who is not affiliated with the captive marine mammal industry agrees that this is not appropriate pairing for her. And it's like, for example, while they are both dolphins, orcas are the largest member of the dolphin family, they are no more closely related than you or I and a chimpanzee. And obviously, we can't be confined in a small space with an adult chimpanzee because they would tear us apart.
Yeah,
we're not a compatible species.
I could deal with you, but you and a chimpanzee, that would be difficult. Well, tell me, so before they added these two other dolphins, it was just Lolita and Hugo, which was another orca. And was it just Hugo and Lolita, and were they happy?
I believe it was just Hugo and Lolita at that time, but no, they weren't happy. While she did have social companionship back then, at least, trainers from when she first arrived reported to us that her skin would crack and bleed from being exposed to the hot Miami sun. And so she's never been held in conditions that appropriately replicate what she requires to engage in natural behaviors and to live in some semblance of a natural environment to her.
When did PETA get involved? Hugo passed away. Lolita has been there for some time because Hugo, when he died, it was 1980. So it's been a while. When did PETA get involved, and what have you done to either improve her situation or to change her conditions there at Seaquarium?
PETA became intimately involved in Lolita's case about 10 years ago, and that was the beginning of what I will call a litigation campaign that still continues to this day. We have sued the U.S. Department of Agriculture for rubber stamping the Miami Seaquarium's exhibitor's license, even though the conditions in which Lolita is held pretty clearly violate the plain language of the Animal Welfare Act regulations. And this includes the size of her tank, which, by the way, is the smallest orca tank in the world. The courts in that case ultimately found that the USDA had discretion to just rubber stamp the facility's license, even if they have proof that it isn't actually compliant. The next lawsuit that we pursued, and it had an associated petition that was filed with the National Marine Fisheries Service, because the southern resident killer whale population, from which Lolita was taken back in 1970, was listed as endangered in 2005. But when the agency listed the population, they specifically carved out Lolita from the protections. It said all southern residents are endangered except those currently in captivity at the time of listing. And she was already the only one left at that time.
Why do you think they did that?
The only explanation for them carving her out is to protect the seaquarium and the industry. And it's illegal. They simply can't base an endangered listing decision on whether an animal is captive or in the wild. And so we did successfully convince the National Marine Fisheries Service to remove that exclusion, and that granted Lolita protections from harm and harassment under the Endangered Species Act. So after that success, we sued the Miami Seaquarium under the Endangered Species Act directly, alleging that these conditions in which she's held, where she's, again, abused by her incompatible tank mate, she's exposed to the hot Florida sun that causes her skin and likely her eyes injury, and other ailments that we learned about through the litigation that violated the ESA. Unfortunately, again, the courts ultimately determined that even crediting all of that evidence of her suffering, our expert witnesses, dozens and dozens of pages of expert reports describing the manner in which she is suffering from these conditions, the court still held that that didn't equate to a violation of the Endangered Species Act.
Wow, how frustrating was that? I mean, just as you described the amount of work, and some people would say, is it worth fighting for that one orca? Is it worth doing that amount of effort? And clearly, you must feel that it is.
Absolutely. Lolita is a sentient and incredibly intelligent individual, and that's what PETA cares about. We're here to protect individual non-human animals from exploitation and abuse, and Lolita is unquestionably being abused. And we have these legal mechanisms that are supposed to protect her, so we're going to pursue them. The court in the Endangered Species Act cases, the appellate court, I think, even telegraphed that it didn't really think its decision was firmly based on the law, but more so because Lolita had already been in captivity for 40 some odd years, the court didn't feel comfortable requiring her to be moved because it was afraid that her blood would be on their hands if she ultimately died. That's the subtext to the decisions, at least as I read them. So that was the end of the Endangered Species Act lawsuit, but we still have another case pending against the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Similar to the first one, it relates to their decision to license the Seaquarium, but whereas the courts previously held that the USDA can rubber stamp renewal licenses, we are sort of out of that whole paradigm of renewal because in 2016, the facility was sold from its prior owner to Palace Entertainment. And at that time, the agency was unquestionably required to ensure that the facility was compliant with the Animal Welfare Act before granting it a license. The district court decided against us. We prevailed on appeal, and we're back before the district court now.
If you win, the Seaquarium have to give up Lolita to PETA? Does PETA then place her in a sanctuary? What happens if you win?
So the remedy in the case is effectively that the Seaquarium needs to come in compliance with the Animal Welfare Act. And we know they can't do that with Lolita's current tank, which means she does need to be moved elsewhere. Her ownership wouldn't be transferred to PETA, but we would certainly work with the facility to identify the proper location for her based on the evaluation of independent experts of her well-being. And there are many people, many experts out there who believe that she is a candidate to be moved to a seaside sanctuary in her home waters, which is essentially like a netted off pen that would enable her to feel the ocean's currents, still receive food and veterinary care as needed, and potentially even interact with the other southern resident orcas and her family. The orca believed to be her mom is still alive and swimming in those waters.
There was a concern that if she was moved, she wouldn't survive. Is that a real concern?
She requires an actual independent assessment of her welfare. That's not something that the Seaquarium has ever allowed before. To the extent that the court felt that way, which again, I think the court was telegraphing, but didn't explicitly say that, it was based on the Seaquarium's own representations in our lawsuit. We've never seen any sort of independent assessment indicating that she's not a candidate to be moved.
How many of these orcas are alive right now and in captivity that you know of? And I mean, it's a fairly small number. Lolita's an endangered species.
Her family, the southern resident orcas, she is the only one remaining in captivity. Her family is critically endangered. There are 70 some odd members, and they've been struggling to recover ever since her capture. There are several reasons why the population is endangered, including vessel traffic, increased pollution. But one of the primary issues is that the population was entirely decimated for marine parks. That's it for the southern residents in captivity, but there are other orcas. She is the only one in the United States at a facility other than SeaWorld. There are about 20 orcas at SeaWorld parks. And as you may know, they have made the decision that the orcas who are currently there will be the last ones after an incredible amount and years of pressure from PETA and other groups. So they've agreed not to breed them and not to bring in any new orcas to their tanks. So that's hopefully the beginning of the end of orcas in captivity in the United States. However, there are some overseas as well. In France, at a facility called Marineland Antibes, and China and Russia have resumed captures and putting these orcas, newly captured orcas, in tanks.
This has really been the life for Lolita. She's 56 years old, and now you've learned that Lolita is sick and may be dying.
We learned from a whistleblower that she is suffering from pneumonia. And this is concerning because apart from her age, pneumonia is a common cause of death of captive orcas. 10 or 12 orcas, something along those lines, have died of pneumonia in SeaWorld's tanks. So we know this is something that can be fatal for her. And we're also concerned that she's not getting adequate veterinary care at the Miami Seaquarium because of who is caring for her.
So what is the concern about the veterinarian or the person who is treating Lolita?
The current veterinarian was hired for about 7 months from 2019 to 2020, which was her very first experience with orcas. She left the facility then and was only hired back after the two veterinarians there quit, or rather left for different circumstances. The longtime veterinarian who had been there for 25 to 30 years was essentially forced out after she began voicing her concerns about the welfare of the animals there.
What is your overall concern about the ability for Lolita to get adequate care, period?
There is the concern about her having adequate veterinary care. We do know that they are working with a consultant who often works with the marine mammal industry. So it's always difficult to know to what extent these individuals are putting the animal's best interests first versus the facility's interests. And also just whether she's able to recover continuing to live in these dismal conditions. We received drone video from just last week over her tank, and it is decrepit. It's filled with algae. It appears to be cracking. The paint is peeling. And it's possible that no amount of veterinary care can nurse her back to health when she's forced to live in these conditions.
Her tank isn't taken care of?
That's exactly right. And I think it has long been clear blue water, but I think that has changed because her tank and the area surrounding it has been off limits to the public since October.
Yeah, due to COVID?
It actually was not due to COVID. The facility was closed for a little while due to COVID earlier on. But after the USDA released a damming inspection report of the facility in September, they closed that stadium area to purportedly make some improvements. I don't know the status of any of these improvements. My understanding is that the USDA is just wrapping up a new investigation of the facility. Because the public has not been there to see her, they've not had to ensure that the water is crystal clear, so the patrons are happy.
Tell me about that 17-page document that you referred to. How damning is it, and is it probably something that could help PETA in its legal action?
It certainly has helped PETA tremendously, whether it be in the legal action or just rallying the public to demand better of the Seaquarium and to avoid marine parks. But this report shows what we've been saying for years, that animals are suffering terribly at the Miami Seaquarium. The tanks are in disrepair with poor water quality. There's inadequate protection from the sun. And they're being held with incompatible animals who regularly injure and kill them. So I mentioned to you the fact that Lolita is harassed by other Pacific white-sided dolphins in her tank. But within the span of just 15 months, 2 dolphins and a young sea lion were all killed by their tank mates at the Miami Seaquarium. Their necropsy reports, their animal autopsies showed that they were killed by trauma. And even after all of this happened, animals continued to be injured by others in their tanks. And the USDA report indicates that the Seaquarium still, at the time of the inspection, did not have any way of determining who was incompatible to help avoid the issue from happening again in the future. That is sort of very broadly the concerns that were raised in the report. But specific to Lolita, they were ignoring the veterinarian's advice, again, the veterinarian who was forced out of there, including by reducing her food intake dramatically, requiring her to perform certain tricks that likely injured her jaw, and feeding her rotten fish. And they were actually planning on putting more dolphins in the tank with her, in complete disregard for the dysfunction that was already there.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm seeing in some notes about the USDA report, apparently it's the first time the USDA cited a facility for insufficient shade.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, for Lolita, we have to acknowledge that the water is incredibly shallow, so it doesn't really allow her to escape the rays and the ultraviolet radiation from the sun.
Right.
For other animals, they're essentially required to look up into the sun to get their food when they're being fed by trainers or the public. And there are no artificial structures in those areas to provide shade when that's happening. But you're right, this is the first time that the Seaquarium was cited for this, even though there have been no changes to the facility in 5 decades in this regard. We've been complaining, and it's been part of our lawsuit, that Lolita doesn't have inadequate shade for a decade. And now, finally, for the very first time, the agency is agreeing with us. So that goes to show you it's a matter of politics, whether they have the interest in actually enforcing the law against these facilities, because the facts haven't changed. The facility was in violation, and they continue to be.
Yeah. Well, tell me about just Lolita's general condition. You got the whistleblower saying she's sick, she could be dying. What is the threat right now to Lolita's health? Is it critical? Is she getting better? Do you know, or do you have people telling you every week or so her condition?
There are conflicting reports about it. So we learned late last week that after she first became ill, Lolita was then on 24-hour watch. So that certainly indicates that things were taking a turn for the worse, that they needed to monitor her at all times. My understanding is that that is still happening. Of course, does not bode well for her. The Seaquarium has said things from she's all right, which indicates that, they might agree that she's not doing that well, to she's improving. But they have not provided any sort of evidence of the fact that she's improving, nor do we have any reason to take their statements at face value when they've lied about her condition and the harm that she suffers for the 56 years that she's been there.
Do you expect someday soon to get, a report that isn't quite so rosy?
From the Seaquarium directly? No. Not at all. But I mentioned that the USDA is just completing its subsequent investigation. So it is possible that, just like the inspection report from last year, that will help reveal some of the truth about what's happening at that facility. It's the difficulty with marine parks like this. It is a very insular community. There have been lots of issues at the Seaquarium with former employees saying that their facility is just lying to USDA inspectors. Unless their hand is forced, we can't expect to get anything truthful from them.
Unless PETA is constantly there to monitor, then who else is there? Who else would be there for Lolita?
That's exactly right. We broke the news that she was apparently suffering from pneumonia, and that fortunately has gotten a lot of people interested in this. Just the end of last week, Miami-Dade commissioner, who is sort of spearheading the potential transfer of the lease from the current owners to a company that's looking to buy the Seaquarium, called for an independent assessment of Lolita's welfare before this transfer goes through. So that could potentially be a boon for her as well.
So we're not really sure how this is going to go. She could recover or she may not. I mean, it's not clear about where she is on the, in the critical list. She's sick, pneumonia, but do orcas recover?
Yes, I mean, orcas do recover from pneumonia. It's just a question of whether she can. How severe is this pneumonia? Whether her immune system is otherwise well enough to recover from it, whether she is getting the appropriate care. So it is, like you said, it's a big question mark, and we don't know if she's going to recover from this. But if she does, this is certainly as big a sign as any that the Seaquarium needs to do right by her and begin the process of transferring her to a sanctuary as soon as she is able to do it.
Now, what can PETA do about all this at this point? I know you said you have one lawsuit pending. Where does it go now for you, since you're the Lolita expert on the legal team? Well, what is the hope now?
I can't talk about any legal initiatives that we might pursue that we haven't yet. But in addition to our current pending lawsuit, we're certainly keeping a very close eye on the USDA and their inspection and investigation to ensure that nothing is swept under the rug, to the extent that we can ensure that, and keeping the pressure on the agency to do the right thing, as it finally did last year with that inspection report. Continuing to sound the alarm about the suffering of Lolita and other animals in these tanks, so individuals know what they're supporting when they go to a facility like this, and that the simplest way to end cetacean captivity is simply to avoid going to the parks. If people aren't coming in the gates to see them, then the facilities aren't going to confine them to these woefully inadequate tanks.
Jared, you've been working on this specific case for some time. How long? And since you've been working on this, how concerned are you personally about the well-being of Lolita right now?
I have been working on this since PETA began in 2012. So it is definitely something that I've been very close to. I've spent some time with her at the Seaquarium, and I'm very concerned for her well-being. It's not just the illness, of course. It's difficult to know whether she's suffering more in potential death than she is in life at the Seaquarium, because the one thing we do know is that she's going through a lot there. The attacks from the other animals, the inadequate water quality, the rotten fish, being forced to perform tricks for audiences. Her life is barely a life at all. And certainly my wish is for her to recover from this illness and to finally get to see the ocean again.
Jared Goodman, PETA's Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Animal Law, Legal and Corporate Affairs. He battles Seaquarium in Miami on behalf of Lolita. For more, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, or see my vlog at amok.com, or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.